everyone. Hello, everybody. I'm very excited to present this all to you. It is Expressionism in Classical Music, a look into the history and context of expressionistic music. What actually made it Expressionism? And was it Expressionism? Yes, very intriguing. Let's continue. A brief history of Expressionism. So Expressionism originally began in poetry and art. It was first used as an adjective in the late 19th century, but didn't come into the use how we use it now to describe expressionistic music during its height in the early 20th century. The term started to come into use to describe that in about 1910 to 1912. And expressionistic art, it showcases distorted realities, which are meant to symbolize subconscious feelings. So a lot of expressionistic art, you will see instead of depicting reality, it depicts emotions and how we react to certain occurrences in our life or certain things in our life. So art uses intense, unrealistic colors, kind of like blurred brush strokes. It's very textured and is very mystical and can be almost dreamlike, like it's not real or it's a subjected reality. And some notable artists from this time period were Edvard Munch, Van Gogh, and Matisse. So like I said earlier, the term expressionist art, how we use it now, the modern term first came into use in 1910 when Matisse and the other Fauves, it was a group of artists wanted to take a break from Impressionism. And the term soon widened to include a variety of all contemporary non-traditional art. So this was paintings, this was music, anything that didn't conform to the norm started to be called expressionist. Okay, and here's some more expressionistic paintings. By Van Gogh. On the right is a self-portrait of him in a straw hat, and on the left is a wheat field with cypresses. And as you can see, like the heavy individual brush strokes, it's not creating like a clear, smooth image. It's very textured. As you can see, the clouds and the plants in wheat field with cypress, like the clouds, it's very mystical and unnatural and almost dreamlike. So this is a painting by Picasso in 1903 to 1904. This was some of his early work before he dived into Cubism. This was considered expressionist just because of the distorted reality. You can see how the man has like very elongated limbs, and it's just a very unnatural position that he's in. I mean, it's a somber kind of mood. It's meant to express the feeling as opposed to being a beautiful artwork. I mean, his skin is blue, just the whole piece is blue. And so that's meant to just explore the altered reality. All right, so this expressionistic movement, expressionism appears as an adjective in the late 18th century. It didn't really show up as a dictionary use until around 1911. And expressionism strived to express the subconscious feelings, like what we experience unconsciously as a reaction to occurrences or events or even just things in artists and our lives. It's supposed to represent raw emotion. And so art and music expressionist art and music weren't really meant to fit the norms of conventional beauty. And it continues to live on even today in new guises. But what I'm focusing on in this presentation is expressionistic art and music during the height of it during the beginning of the 20th century. Expressionism defined in classical music. So kind of the biggest common understanding of expressionism would be from Schoenberg's post-tonal period, but before his 12-tone period. So it could be considered atonal, but it was definitely a breakaway from the strict tonality of music and the romanticism that occurred before it. The current meaning of expressionism was coined by a critic, Roger Elliott Fry, to contrast that of impressionism. It was meant to display concepts of psychology and the unconscious, especially during this time when it was just a place of discovery and it was new, and this is where artists were going to find inspiration for their art. And according to Kandinsky, expressionist music demanded emancipation from the lie of convention and tradition. So basically, in order for any art form to be considered expressionist, in defined by Kandinsky, it was to break away from just everything that was the norm before music. It was to break away what he liked to call a lie, because it was just a concept in music for so long that it had to be beautiful and it had to be a certain way. So expressionistic music, according to Kandinsky, was just anything that broke away from that lie, anything that broke away from the convention and norm of music for the past centuries leading up to this point. So Schoenberg was probably the most well-known expressionist composer of the era. Schoenberg's expressionism, he drew from Greek philosophy and German idealism to create his own truth as opposed to traditional beauty. So his truth was breaking away from that lie that Kandinsky defined as music up until this point. So his own truth, he developed his own philosophy to portray his truth as opposed to a traditional beauty. And oftentimes his truth was very emotional. It was very raw. Schoenberg went through a lot in his life, especially with his personal relationships, and his music reflects that. So it very much dives into his own raw emotions. And that was his breakaway from the truth and his own representation of beauty. It is defined by inner vision and compulsion, not by refinement. So nothing has to be strictly in tune, strictly beautiful, strictly dynamic. It is the inner vision, however the artist wishes to express those inner feelings. It truthfulness to inner realities, so being truthful of the emotions, how sometimes, you know how people get really angry and sometimes we wish we could just break something. That is what they try to express in music. They're really inner realities, those raw feelings that we kind of see as ugly or unattractive, and that's what they really wanted to formulate and cultivate within their music. And a lot of times it was characterized by texture as opposed to dynamics or contrast. All right, so now we're going to get into the nitty gritty. Was Schoenberg's music expressionist? And this goes for other expressionist composers of their time. Was their music truly written to be defined as expressionism? So according to David Fanning, the term expressionism is a broad term used to include other music from the same period with shared characteristics. So during this time, critics began to use the term expressionism to just kind of group together everything that was modern, that was contemporary, that didn't fit the traditional norm. And he even goes as far to call it a journalistic term to imply disapproval. Expressionism has had a disdain for concrete meaning, which means that many composers recognize in essence most music was already expressionist, and that expressionist music was something of tautology. And this is why a lot of composers like Schoenberg, Kandinsky, they didn't use the word to describe themselves or their music, because it was an understanding that anything that was a breakaway from the old concrete meaning was now considered expressionist. Yet that was what all music was doing. So composers would rarely use the term to call their music expressionist unless they were really trying to define a certain artwork as so. However, I do not think that composers intentionally wrote their music to be expressionist. It was labeled so by public opinion and critics during the time. Expressionism was not a school, but rather a state of mind. And music is created by the feeling of that internal or external process. And so that is something, another thing that expressionist art tried and music tried to achieve. After this, Schoenberg began to move into his 12-tone techniques. And so he began to move beyond the psychological truths of expression. And when I say this, I mean during a time Schoenberg was writing music that was being labeled as expressionist. However, after the height of expressionism, he began to move away just from atonality and take a step even further into the world of 12 tone. And so this shows how perhaps for a particular moment, Schoenberg was writing music that was expressionist, or it was just a part of his artistic process as music is ever evolving. And that was the music he was creating at the time to express his raw emotions, not that he necessarily intended for his music to be labeled as expressionist. So expressionistic music fell out of popularity after the World Wars as political instability and social unrest called for regulation and stability within music. And during this time, Schoenberg had already moved past his expressionistic era. Was it really expressionist? Part 2. So according to the musicologist Claire Carrasco, here's a quote from him. Like all isms, expressionism is a multifaceted construction whose meaning critics and scholars have continuously negotiated and renegotiated since its introduction into art and literary discourse circa 1910. So this shows how the definition of expressionism has changed drastically since 1910. I feel like during 1910, the term expressionism was heavily defined by critics of the time and how critics wanted expressionism to be perceived by the public. However, over time, musicologists have come to formulate and reformulate their own definitions of expressionism. So the fact that the definition has changed so much over a century, it makes it very difficult to say whether an artist was writing their music to be an expressionist. If we have so many different definitions of expressionism, how do we know what the composer's intent was? This is why I'm arguing that the composer did not intentionally write the music to be expressionist. However, society and critics at the time were labeling it as so. So continuing on, Carrasco examined different critics of the 1918 premiere of Zemlinsky's second string quartet, and reviews called it experimental and revolutionary. However, scholars and musicologists would hesitate to agree. He argues that the ideas of modern music were designated as expressionist, and discussion of Zemlinsky's quartet would intersect with that idea. So because it was kind of a buzzword and it was a kind of a trendy word, critics began to latch on to this idea of expressionism, and they called Zemlinsky's music expressionist because it was kind of trending and they wanted to put his music in a box. And because it was modern, because it was breaking away from the norms of music for so long and it was just different, it wasn't necessarily radical. Musicologists would not call it radical or revolutionary in any way. However, because it was modern, it was automatically grouped into this expressionist zone. So there are a disconnect between critics and musicologists' discourse of expressionism throughout time. So what did critics have to say? I won't read both quotes because they are a little long. I will read the second quote by Marx. It says, "A struggling will is at work here." And this is in response to Zemlinsky's second string quartet premiere in 1918. He says, "A struggling will is at work here, which binds rhythms, keys, and themes according to its whim, so that one frequency cannot rid oneself of the impression of violence. Certainly a significant artist creates here, one to whom his ideals are sacred and wondrous, the iron consistency with which he represents those ideals, often against his own interest." So in the quote on the right, Marx labels Zemlinsky's music as expressionist. It's not the full review, but it's part of the review. And during this time, the term had yet widely been labeled to music. And so once they saw this piece and they were comparing it to Schoenberg's music, just because of how, I guess, modern during the time it shows that music was labeled and not explicitly created to be expressionist. So critics were labeling music as expressionist, and the public caught on to this and also began to label music of the time expressionist. However, I do not believe that artists were creating it to be labeled so. And by comparing Zemlinsky's to Schoenberg, as the quote on the left does, groups together composers under the same category. This also shows how critics influence the definition of expressionism in classical music. So for my conclusion, I just want to restate my argument. I believe expressionistic art and music have overlapping avant-garde attributes, but I do not think composers actually wrote music with the intent of it being perceived as expressionist. While there are qualities of expressionism in the music, the term was associated with many pieces of music simply because they were too modern to be perceived as otherwise during the time. Critics heavily controlled the discourse of expressionistic music during the early 20th century. This led to it not only being romanticized, and by romanticized, I don't mean finding romance within the music, I just mean it kind of being trendy among the public and taking on a meaning that it didn't initially have. But it forced contemporary music of the era into a box. While I believe expressionistic art, poetry, and music share many parallels, I also believe that the term acted more of a buzzword for critics who hope to profit off labeling any contemporary work as expressionist. And here are my sources. Thank you all for sharing this time with me. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you. Bye.